Trapper spent decades hunting creatures in the Appalachian Mountains that most of the world refused to believe existed. He faced things in those woods that would have ended any other man's investigation before it started, and he went back every time. But in his final days, he said something about one investigation that he had never said about any other, that it scared him, that what the Ames team found during that hunt was something he was not prepared for. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what Trapper revealed changes everything. John "Trapper" Tice was not a man who frightened easily. That is not a characterization built from the edited version of him that Mountain Monsters presented to its audience across 8 seasons of television. It is a characterization built from the full body of evidence of how he lived, the decades of hunting and fieldwork in some of the most remote and unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States, the community relationships he maintained across generations of Appalachian families who trusted him with accounts of experiences they would never share with an outsider, and the operational culture he built within the Ames team that treated the phenomena they were hunting not as entertainment, but as a genuine and serious subject requiring genuine and serious investigation. Trapper grew up in the tradition of Appalachian mountain culture that understands the wilderness as a place inhabited by things that do not appear in any official catalog, and that has never required outside validation for that understanding. The oral tradition of the region he operated in, the accounts passed down through families across generations describing creatures, presences, and phenomena in the mountains that defy the frameworks of mainstream biology and conventional experience, was not exotic folklore to Trapper. It was the informational context within which he had operated his entire adult life. He brought that context to Mountain Monsters, and it gave the show something that no production budget or network development process could manufacture: an investigator whose engagement with the subject was rooted in a relationship with the land and its people that predated cameras by several decades. The Ames team he assembled and led reflected that same quality. These were not paranormal television personalities recruited for their on-camera charisma. They were men with specific skills and specific backgrounds whose value to the investigation was practical rather than presentational. Trapper understood what each of them brought to the field and deployed those capabilities with the methodical deliberateness of someone who had been thinking about how to find these creatures long before anyone offered him a television show to do it. What made him exceptional as an investigator was not his willingness to go into dangerous terrain in the dark, though that willingness was genuine and documented across every season of the show. It was his ability to read the Appalachian landscape, the signs, the silences, the behavioral indicators that something significant had passed through an area or was currently present in it, with a fluency that came from a lifetime of immersion in that environment. He was not startled by the mountains. He was at home in them in a way that went beyond familiarity into something closer to belonging, which is why what he said about the investigation that scared him most carries a weight that nothing in the Mountain Monsters broadcast record approaches. A man who belonged to those mountains, who had spent decades in them encountering things that most people would find terrifying without ever describing himself as frightened, identified one investigation as the exception. That exception is what this video is about. The broadcast version of Mountain Monsters presented its investigations within a format that the paranormal television landscape had established. Dramatic music, night vision sequences, constructed traps that almost but never quite caught anything, and a tone that balanced genuine fieldwork with the entertainment requirements of cable television. That format served the show well commercially across 8 seasons, and built a dedicated audience that followed the Ames team through the full range of Appalachian cryptid territory. What it did not fully convey was the nature of what the investigation was actually accumulating beneath the surface of the broadcast material. The Appalachian mountain range is one of the oldest geological formations on the North American continent, and one of the most consistently documented regions in the history of American cryptid and paranormal encounter reports. The density of the forest, the isolation of the communities embedded within it, and the cultural tradition of those communities, which has never treated anomalous experience as something requiring outside confirmation before it can be considered real, has produced a body of encounter testimony that stretches back further than any other comparable region in the country. Trapper understood this body of testimony not as a catalog of claims to be investigated, but as an accumulated record of observation from people who had been living alongside whatever inhabits those mountains for generations. The Ames team's investigations were, in this framing, not discovery operations. They were documentation operations. They were going into terrain where the local population already knew something was there, and attempting to produce evidence of sufficient quality to bring that knowledge into a form that the outside world could engage with. That distinction matters for understanding what the investigation that scared Trapper most actually produced. The show had documented compelling evidence across multiple seasons, physical signs of large unknown creatures, eyewitness accounts from credible local sources, audio recordings of vocalizations that did not match any known animal in the regional wildlife catalog. None of it had crossed the specific threshold that Trapper maintained in his own private assessment of the investigation's finding, the threshold between evidence that pointed towards something and evidence that confirmed it. The investigation he identified in his final days as the one that scared him most was the investigation that crossed that threshold, not because it produced better physical evidence than prior investigations, though what the cameras documented during that investigation exceeded anything the show had previously captured, but because of what the evidence implied about the nature of what the Ames team had been hunting across all the prior seasons, and what that thing's relationship to the human communities living in its territory actually was. To understand why the investigation Trapper identified as his most frightening encounter matters beyond its immediate evidence. It is necessary to understand the broader tradition within which the Ames team was operating, the Appalachian cultural and historical context that informed Trapper's understanding of what lived in those mountains and what its presence meant for the people who shared that territory with it. The Appalachian mountain communities that Mountain Monsters drew its witness testimony from are not communities that discovered the creatures they described through the show's investigation process. They are communities that have maintained continuous awareness of those creatures across generations of coexistence that has not always been peaceful, and that has produced a body of transmitted knowledge about the behavior, the capabilities, and the boundaries of the beings that inhabit the deep mountain terrain alongside the human population. That transmitted knowledge takes different forms in different communities. Some of it is embedded in the hunting and land use traditions of families that have worked specific sections of mountain territory for generations. Knowledge about which areas are avoided, which times of year bring increased signs of non-human presence, and what behaviors indicate that the boundary between the human and non-human territories is being approached or crossed. Some of it exists in the religious and spiritual frameworks that Appalachian mountain culture has developed across its history, frameworks that treat the presence of powerful non-human beings in the wilderness as a theological reality rather than a folkloric tradition, and that have specific doctrinal positions about the nature of those beings and the appropriate human relationship to them. Trapper was embedded in this tradition in a way that shaped every operational decision the Ames team made in the field. The locations he chose to investigate, the local sources he consulted before entering new territory, and the behavioral lines he established for the team during active hunts all reflected a knowledge base that went significantly deeper than anything the broadcast episodes made visible. The investigation he identified in his final days as his most frightening experience was frightening in part because of what it produced on camera, but it was frightening in larger part because of how what it produced on camera aligned with specific elements of the Appalachian traditional knowledge that Trapper had been carrying for decades, elements that he had hoped, across all the prior investigations, would not be confirmed in the direct and unambiguous form the evidence from that hunt produced. He had spent his career operating in the knowledge that the mountains contained something extraordinary. The investigation that scared him most was the one that told him specifically what that something was, and the answer aligned with the most serious and consequential interpretation of the Appalachian tradition, not the folkloric edge of it, but the theological core. The investigation Trapper identified as the most frightening of his career did not begin with any indication that it would end differently from the dozens of hunts the Ames team had conducted across the prior seasons. The location was in territory the team knew, a section of Appalachian mountain terrain that had generated consistent reports of anomalous creature activity across an extended period, and that had produced credible witness testimony from local sources whose relationship with Trapper gave their accounts a weight that anonymous reports would not have carried. The decision to investigate that specific location at that specific time was driven by an escalation in the reported activity that Trapper's local contacts had been describing over the preceding months, an escalation that was unusual not in the category of phenomenon being reported, but in its frequency and its proximity to the areas of human habitation at the edge of the deep mountain territory where the activity was normally concentrated. Something had moved closer. Whatever had been operating in the deep terrain of that mountain section was generating signs of its presence in areas it had not previously occupied, and the people living nearest to those areas were communicating a level of concern that Trapper took seriously, precisely because these were not people who communicated concern about mountain phenomena casually. The Ames team entered the investigation location in the early evening with their standard equipment configuration and the expectation that the elevated activity reports would translate into a productive investigation night. What they encountered within the first 2 hours exceeded the preliminary assessment of the location's activity level in ways that the team's prior experience in comparable terrain had not fully prepared them for. The signs of recent presence in the investigation area were not the ambiguous indicators that require expert interpretation to identify as significant. They were immediate and unmistakable, physical evidence of something large operating in the area within a time frame that placed its presence in the investigation zone concurrent with the team's arrival. The forest behavior was the first indicator that registered across the full team simultaneously. The ambient sound environment of a mountain forest at night is one that every member of the Ames team had extensive experience reading. The baseline of insect, bird, and small animal activity that provides a continuous acoustic map of what is and is not present in the surrounding terrain. That baseline shut down within 30 minutes of the team's entry into the investigation area, in a pattern that Trapper later described as the most complete and rapid cessation of ambient sound he had experienced in decades of mountain fieldwork. Not a gradual thinning of background noise as the team's presence registered with the wildlife in the surrounding area. A simultaneous and total shutdown that covered a radius of forest significantly larger than the team's immediate position, the kind of acoustic displacement that indicates the presence of something that the local wildlife recognizes as a predator of sufficient significance to trigger a unified silence response across multiple species at once. The footage from the investigation that Trapper identified as his most frightening experience documents a sequence of events across approximately 4 hours of active fieldwork that the Mountain Monsters production had never captured in any comparable form across the prior seasons of the show. The opening phase of the investigation footage is consistent with what the broadcast episodes had established as the show's standard field documentation. The team moving through the investigation area, calling out observations, responding to instrument readings, and establishing the baseline evidence picture before the active phase of the hunt began. What the cameras began capturing in the second hour of the investigation is where the footage diverges from anything in the show's prior record. The first significant moment documented on camera occurs without any dramatic buildup or visible trigger. A sudden and complete reorientation of every member of the Ames team toward the same direction simultaneously, without verbal communication between them, in response to something the audio track captures in the infrasound range below the threshold of comfortable human hearing. The team's physical response to that sound, the stiffening of posture, the immediate halt of all movement, the particular quality of stillness that experienced mountain hunters adopt when they have registered a predator stimulus, is visible on camera without any of the standard Mountain Monsters' dramatic framing around it. This was not a television reaction. The cameras then captured what happened when the team advanced toward the source of the infrasound. In the tree line approximately 80 yards from the team's position, movement became visible across multiple camera feeds simultaneously. Not the movement of a single entity passing through the frame, but a pattern of movement that indicated multiple presences repositioning in the dark timber in a coordinated manner that the team's experienced hunters recognized immediately as deliberate rather than incidental. What those multiple presences did over the following 90 minutes, the coordinated movement, the vocalizations that the audio equipment captured with a clarity and a complexity that exceeded anything the show had previously recorded, and the specific behavioral pattern that Trapper later described as the detail that frightened him most, is documented on camera in a form that left no member of the team with any ambiguity about what they were experiencing. The broadcast audience saw a version of that night. What they saw was not the version the cameras captured. Across 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters and decades of fieldwork in the Appalachian Mountains before the show existed, Trapper had developed a working understanding of the behavioral boundaries that defined his relationship with whatever inhabited the deep mountain territory his team investigated. Those boundaries had held across every prior investigation, an implicit negotiation between the human presence of the Ames team and the non-human presence of the creatures they were hunting, in which both parties maintained a specific distance that neither crossed without the investigation reaching a natural conclusion. The moment Trapper identified in his final days as the moment that frightened him most was the moment during the investigation documented in this video when that boundary was crossed. Not by the Ames team advancing further into the territory of whatever they were hunting. By whatever they were hunting, advancing into theirs. The cameras documented the moment the coordinated presences in the tree line began moving toward the team's position, rather than maintaining the parallel tracking behavior they had been exhibiting across the prior portion of the investigation. Trapper's response to that movement, visible on camera before any verbal communication between team members, was the response of a man whose decades of experience in those mountains had just told him something that his prior experience had not prepared him to process in real time. He had spent years operating on the understanding that the creatures the Ames team hunted were aware of the human investigators in their territory, were capable of monitoring and responding to that presence with a sophistication that went beyond animal instinct, and maintained a consistent behavioral pattern of avoidance that kept the investigations within a range of danger his experience could account for. What advanced out of that tree line toward the team's position that night was not behaving within that pattern, and what Trapper saw in the quality of that advance, in the deliberateness of it, the patience of it, and the specific directional intention it communicated, was the detail he referenced in his final days as the thing he could never fully set aside after that investigation was over. It was not the size of what came toward them, it was not the speed, it was the intelligence the advance communicated, an intelligence that understood exactly what the Ames team was, exactly what their equipment was capable of documenting, and exactly how close it could come before the investigation would break. It came to that line, and it held there, and it looked at Trapper with the full weight of something that had been in those mountains long before any human institution had been keeping records about what lived there. He never said what looked back at him from the dark, but in his final days he said that whatever it was, it knew him, and that it had known him for longer than he had known it. The question of why Trapper maintained silence about the investigation that scared him most across the years between when it occurred and his final days is not a simple one. The simplest component of the answer is the one that applies to any person operating within a television production framework: the contractual and institutional constraints that govern what cast members of a cable television show can and cannot say publicly about their experiences on that show and the evidence those experiences produced. Those constraints were real, and Trapper operated within them as every Mountain Monsters cast member did. But contractual constraint alone does not account for the specific character of the silence Trapper maintained about this investigation. He was not a man who found silence easy when he believed something important needed to be said, and across his public life he had demonstrated a willingness to push against institutional boundaries when the subject matter was significant enough to justify it. The silence about this investigation was different in character from the ordinary professional discretion he applied to the show's unreleased material. It was a silence that the people closest to him during the final years of his life have described as deliberate in a way that went beyond network compliance. A decision he had made about this specific investigation that was rooted not in contractual obligation, but in a personal reckoning with what the investigation had produced and what saying it publicly would mean. Part of that reckoning was theological. Trapper's relationship to the Appalachian religious tradition, the specific framework within which the communities he worked with understood the presence of powerful non-human beings in the mountain territory, had been shaped by a lifetime of encounter with evidence that pushed against the boundaries of what that framework could comfortably contain. The investigation that scared him most had pushed through those boundaries in a way that forced a personal confrontation with the most serious implications of what he believed about the nature of the things he had spent his career hunting. He was not ready to say those implications out loud for most of the years that followed the investigation. What changed in his final days was the same thing that changes the calculation for anyone approaching the end of their life about what they can afford to leave unsaid. The professional consequences of speaking no longer carried the weight they had. The personal reckoning he had been conducting privately about what the investigation meant and what it implied about the nature of the beings the Ames team had encountered across all the prior seasons had reached a conclusion, and the people he trusted most, the individuals who were present with him in those final days and who have shared his words in the time since, heard him say what he had spent years deciding how to say. He said it was real. He said it was not an animal. He said what came toward them that night in the tree line knew exactly what it was doing. And he said that the thing that frightened him most was not what it was. It was that it had always been there, and it had always known they were coming, and it had been deciding for a very long time how close it was willing to let them get.